Greetings, everyone, and welcome to God Save the King. I am your host, Tim Keyes. I want to thank you for listening to God Save the King on the Truth Be Told radio network, where you can listen every Friday night at 10 p.m. Eastern. God Save the King, once again, is my ongoing 30-plus year biblical, historical, and scientific research project devoted to retelling the Nativity the way it really would have happened. So, in other words, one of the things we do here is we rescue truth from familiarity. Unfortunately, the traditional Nativity story is, number one, it's just really not all that accurate to begin with. And then number two, it is so familiar to us that we tend to not think critically about the Nativity when we read the what are called the infancy narratives in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, and we read those narratives and we think we know the story, and as a result, we turn off the critical thinking switch in our brains, and we really don't pay much attention. So I want to encourage you to open your mind, open your ears, open your Bibles, because maybe the Nativity doesn't look quite like we think it does. Now, if you appreciate content like this, we really appreciate it. Both me and the TBTRN network would really appreciate it if you would like and subscribe to our social media. So whether it's at the TBTRN website, where you can go there and click on the big listen button, or whether you're catching me on YouTube, or on Facebook, would you please like and subscribe, because that will really help us out. My website is www.godsavetheking.org, and Truth Be Told is www.truthbetoldnetwork.org. So we really appreciate you tuning in and listening to the show. Now, in case you either haven't heard me before or haven't heard me in a while, I want to remind you that a lot of the bullet points about the traditional nativity story remain the same. The broad strokes remain the same. The truth is in the details, and that's where we have to, as I said a moment ago, rescue truth from familiarity. So yes, Mary and Joseph definitely traveled from Nazareth to Bethlehem. Yes, the shepherds found a baby in a manger wrapped in swaddling clothes. Yes, the young child Jesus and his parents were visited by wise men from the east. And yes, Joseph, Mary, and Jesus fled to Egypt to avoid Herod's wrath. Okay, so those are some of the broad points that remain the same. But when it comes to the details, there's a lot of details that simply didn't go down the way we think they did, or we're not entirely clear exactly what happened. But for example, Joseph and Mary's journey from Nazareth to Bethlehem was not necessarily a hazardous journey. I've seen it portrayed that way in certain nativity plays and movies. Not necessarily the case, right? There's no donkey mentioned in the record. And that's kind of important. On one hand, that's a detail that doesn't really matter much at all. But on the other hand, it matters because it's not mentioned in the biblical record. So if we are going to portray the story as having happened a certain way, we need to be intellectually honest and say, hey, this is not in the biblical record, but we think it went down like this. So there's no donkey in the biblical record. There's no innkeeper in the biblical record. And that's provocative because there's no inn in the biblical record. It is a guest room. Okay. Jesus was born in a normal Judean home, not in a stable, not in a motel, right? So lots of things like this that are, they're just not really that accurate. And like I said, what we're all about here is we want to portray the nativity story as it really would have happened. And when we start doing this, when we start looking at what really would have happened and start telling the story accurately, it changes the story, frankly, changes the story quite a bit. And it winds up being this, number one, it's really an epic tale. It really, really, truly is an epic tale. It's epic in scale. There are enormous international implications that we're going to talk about on today's show. Really excited about today's show because I get to talk about some stuff we just haven't quite got to yet. So for the past several weeks, we have been looking at the history of the Magi. I took a break for a couple of weeks. I had a death in the family. Unfortunately, my brother Dan passed away, and that affected the ability to make the show for a couple of weeks. And then we also spent a week kind of paying tribute to my brother Dan, because he was instrumental in the early days of God Save the King. So I wanted to honor him by, doing a show talking about, the contributions he made to what is now, my ministry and my show, right? But then we've also spent several weeks looking at the history of the Magi. We started with the fact that this type of celestial observer existed in ancient Mesopotamia for a long time. Many, many hundreds of years, frankly, probably thousands of years prior to the birth of Christ, there were expert level, highly trained, highly skilled celestial observers in Mesopotamia who functioned in a dual political and religious role in the city-states and empires of their day. So that's the truly ancient background of the Magi. And then when you jump up to the first millennia BC, we discover that the Meijians, or the Meijians, were simply one tribe among the Medes. And I'm going to show you that on a map here in a second. And then the Meijians, or the Meijians, they became the hereditary priesthood of the Babylonian Empire. And then as you move forward, they became the hereditary priesthood of the Persian Empire. Then you had the Greek Empire conquer Persia, and the Magi weren't necessarily a unified body under the Greeks like they were under the Babylonians and the Persians. They tended to be scattered all around the Greek Empire, but that doesn't mean people didn't know who they were. Very, very, very interesting. So I'm going to screen share here. Now, those of you that are listening on radio, sorry, this is going to be a little bit tough without the visual aid, but I'm going to screen share here and put up a map, because I'm really excited about this. I love maps, and this is a part of our story that is really very unfamiliar to most people. And to get a visual aid, to get a map up on the screen and be able to look at things here is really going to help people understand what's going on. So if you happen to be watching on YouTube or Facebook or something like that, you can see that I've put a map up here on the screen. And you can see my cursor here, which is really going to be helpful. So this is a map, roughly speaking, of the Eastern Mediterranean. This is the Mediterranean over here. So you've got the Eastern Mediterranean, then you've got the Middle East, and then you've got Central Asia over here, and then down here in the corner is India, okay? And we need to remember that this was the known world at the time. Europe, although, there were certainly inhabitants, we know archaeologically about the ancient inhabitants of Europe and the Americas, North and South America, and Africa at this time. This really was the known world. This was the civilized world at that time. So here's Italy over here, modern Italy, which was Italy back then. Here's Greece, right? This is Asia Minor, what we would call modern Turkey today. And then you've got up here, now this is an interesting part of the map. This is where like modern Armenia is, and that actually plays a pretty significant role in our story. And then in this area right here, if you look at my cursor, in this area right here is what would have been known as Syria, the Roman province of Syria. And then down here, of course, this is where Israel is, right here. This is the Arabian Peninsula. And then over here you have Egypt. And then you have Iran or Persia. Mesopotamia is right in here, okay? And then this is Central Asia, where today you've got Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and then India. And then over here, you're actually starting to see a little bit of China, right? Now, the interesting thing is that all of these locations play a role in our story. As I was indicating earlier, this really truly is an international story. The international implications of this are extraordinary. So let's back up a little bit and review the review just a little bit so I can show you a couple things on the map. So like I said, if you look at this, like if you follow this line right here, this line right here is the Euphrates River. Okay, so that is one of the most important landmarks of the ancient Middle East. And then it's hard to see on this map, but then there's another line that kind of goes like this, and this is the Tigris River, right? And in between these two rivers, and ever so slightly to either side, okay, is what we refer to as Mesopotamia. So lower Mesopotamia would be down here, right? And then upper Mesopotamia would be up here, okay? And the Euphrates made a very natural boundary and frontier between the ancient, as I've already said, city-states and empires of their day and time. Very interesting to note that the word Hebrew means from the other side of the river, and therefore it means from the other side, meaning from the other side, from the eastern side of the Euphrates, from beyond the Euphrates. That's what the word Hebrew actually means. So even though the Hebrews dwelt in Canaan, in the promised land, they were from the other side of the Euphrates, because Aber, which is where we get the name Hebrew, was an ancestor, a preceding ancestor of Abraham. And then, of course, Abraham was called from Ur of the Chaldees, of the Chaldeans, to go to the promised land. And Ur would be right about there, roughly, is where Ur would be, in lower Mesopotamia, in what we would call Chaldea, right? Now, to review some of our just generic history, the Assyrian Empire would have occupied an area about like this. If you follow my cursor, I'm making a circle over upper Mesopotamia, but they also did dip into southern Mesopotamia for a while. They also reached into Asia Minor, which would be Turkey over here. And then, of course, they also reached down into the Levant, into the Bible lands, okay? And what would have happened when the Assyrian Empire, as we remember, they took the northern kingdom of Israel captive, right? There was a couple of big battles that took place right in here that were very, very significant in the ancient world and determined who the superpowers of that day and time were going to be, okay? So when the Assyrian Empire dropped down here and took the northern kingdom captive, then they brought their captives back to this side of the Euphrates up in here. And Nineveh, which was the capital of Assyria, would be like right about there, okay? Nineveh is the rough equivalent of modern Mosul in Iraq. And of course, we've all heard of Mosul because of the Gulf Wars back years ago, right? And then, just so you're aware, if Mosul is right about here, that means that Baghdad and Babylon and Sippar and Ctesiphon are all kind of right in this area here. Those are some of the chief cities of the Babylonian Empire. So the Assyrian Empire, which was predominant in northern Mesopotamia, they conquered the northern kingdom of Judea. But then the Chaldean Empire or the Chaldean dynasty, rather, of the Babylonian Empire, they took on the Assyrians, and they actually defeated the Assyrians at the Battle of Carchemish, which was up here, right? So up in northern Mesopotamia, right on the Euphrates River. Very significant battle of the ancient world. And because of that battle, then the Babylonians became the new superpower of their day and time, because they inherited everything that the Assyrians had conquered, okay? Now, like we said, initially the Magi were, now this is given the fact, remember here, that an elite class of highly educated celestial observers has existed in Mesopotamia for possibly as much as 3,000 years, maybe even more, when we get to our story in the Bible lands around the birth of Jesus Christ. Okay. But by the time we get to the birth of Christ and we read the Gospel of Matthew, Matthew tells his reader that wise men from the east, in the Greek, magoi, that wise men from the east showed up at the court of Herod the Great. He doesn't explain who they are, which leads us to the understanding that Matthew basically assumed we would know who these guys are. At least his readers of that day and time would know who they were. And you would know who they were because, and we're going to get into we're going to move forward in history today, hopefully quite rapidly here, so that we can talk about how and why the populace of Israel or Judea would know who these guys were. It wouldn't be some big mystery, right? But so, like we said, an elite class of celestial observer existed all throughout this area, probably for several thousand years prior to our story, right? But then when you fast forward to right around 6 to 800 BC, Media was a kingdom right in around here. Media. And Media was an independent kingdom for a while, and then it got conquered and brought into the Assyrian Empire, right? So when we read in the writings of Herodotus, right? And let's see, do I have this up here? Oh, I don't have this one up on screen, so we won't go there. But when you read in the writings of Herodotus, he mentions the fact that the Meijians or the Meijians were simply one tribe among the Medes. But like I said, then the Medes got conquered by the Assyrians. Then the Assyrians got conquered by the Babylonians. And apparently, to the best of our understanding, the Meijians, the Magi, they began to demonstrate extraordinary ability as these celestial observers. Also, they demonstrated the ability to interpret dreams, and they also oversaw royal succession. So they became the hereditary priesthood of the Babylonian Empire, but also with a very strong political role, because back then in most city states and nations and empires, religion and politics were joined together. This modern notion of separation of church and state just simply did not exist in the ancient world. Everything was all wrapped up together. So the Magi, or the tribe of the Meijians, apparently, and that doesn't mean that every wise man in Babylon was a Meijian, but they apparently were predominant enough that that name became synonymous with this elite class of celestial observer and dream interpreter and court official. Okay. So, because we do know that under the Babylonians, that Daniel was declared Rab-Mag, okay, which is the chief of the Magi. Daniel was declared chief of the Magi by Nebuchadnezzar. So, there's a little bit of extra insight. Clearly, you didn't have to be a Magian of, an ethnic Median, an ethnic of the tribe of the Meijians to be a wise man. You could be from a different ethnicity, but like I said, apparently they were predominant enough that their name became synonymous, right? So Daniel was chief of the Magi. Then, like I said, and we've repeated many times, then you've got the Babylonian Empire was conquered by Persia. Now, Persia is a little bit to the east. This is the Persian Empire here. So when they moved in and they conquered Babylon, right, they declared Zoroastrianism to be the official religion of the Persian Empire. And as I've mentioned before, very important for us to recognize that this class of celestial observer far predates Zoroaster himself and far predates the practice of the religion known as Zoroastrianism. Therefore, this class of celestial observer probably influenced that religion as much as this religion influenced celestial observation, right? But that is the Persian Empire, and under the Persian Empire, the Magi still were the hereditary priesthood of that empire. And then you got the Greeks, like we've talked about. Now, take note that Greece is actually all the way over here, and Macedonia, which is where Alexander was from. He was Alexander of Macedon, right? Macedonia is northern Greece, right up here. And he conquered from here all the way to here. This is the Indus River in India right here. So that is this, he conquered this enormous chunk of land, and he also conquered up into Central Asia. He, of course, controlled this whole area here. He also controlled a big chunk of Egypt as well, right? And then, when he died, and he died very young, his generals divided up his empire. And the two that are the most important to our story is that Ptolemy controlled Egypt, and then Seleucus controlled all this area here. Seleucus, right? The general Seleucus and the Seleucid Empire controlled all this area. Now, that is an enormous area that was very problematic because due to the desire to create a Hellenic empire, that it would be a unified empire that would speak the same language and have the same religion, but now you've got all these other ethnicities that are involved here. That was not easy to do. You had to import Hellenists from Greece to live in this area to help try to enforce and maintain Alexander's vision. But, that didn't really work very well. So let me show you something here real quick. Let's grab the old screen share here. Boop, doop, doop, doop. And we're going to share something again. So mention the fact that there is a name that we all should be aware of, and that is the Greek mathematician Pythagoras was sent to the East. So this is an example of a Hellenic Greek who went to the East, number one, out of curiosity, but he also went to study with the Magi and then also to help, administrate the Greek Empire in the East. So very, very interesting that, Pythagoras, a name that we all know from high school geometry, studied with the Magi. Very interesting. All right. So let's go back to our map. Let me get back there real quick. So here's our map. So under the Greeks, however, that meant that the Magi became scattered, right? So as I've mentioned before, you would have found Magi in the various courts, in of course, the royal court at Babylon. There, of course, would have been Magi, but you would have had satrapies or provinces throughout Alexander's empire. So in these governmental capitals, you would have had Magi serving there as well. So you would have had Magi all the way over here in Alexandria in Afghanistan. The modern name is Kandahar. Kandahar is Alexandria, right? You would have had Magi at Babylon. You would have had Magi at Antioch here. You would have had Magi at Pergamum. You would have had Magi at Alexandria in Egypt. So they were scattered. They still performed a lot of the same role they did, which is why this is why people knew who they were. This wasn't some big mystery. And then something else we mentioned that I want to remind you of is that because of the Assyrian and the Babylonian captivities, you now have a significant Jewish population outside of the Promised Land in Babylon. And then, of course, under the Persians, Cyrus the Great gives them the opportunity to return to the Promised Land to rebuild the temple, but only a small minority actually returns. The majority of the captives remained in Babylon. So now you have a large Jewish population outside of the Promised Land. So under the Greeks, the Jews in Babylon actually had a much easier time of acclimating to the Greek culture. They were allowed enough liberty by the Greeks that The Greeks didn't come down on them too hard as long as they would pay their taxes, and obey the law and not do the right or wrong thing. Pardon me, they'd pretty much get left alone. But the Jews in the Promised Land had a much rougher time under their Seleucid overlords, who basically declared Judaism illegal and just really put the screws to these guys as hard as they could, right? But, and here's where we're finally so that's review. Now we get to the critical point, which is what happened to the Magi after the Greeks, right? Because you've got the remnants of Alexander's empire all through here, and this empire is slowly disintegrating, right? Also, you've got Ptolemy over here. He's pretty much set up pretty well, but now you've got the Roman Empire coming in from the west, moving to the east, right? So you've got the disintegrating Seleucid Empire. Ptolemy is okay for the moment, but then you've got Rome moving in from the west. So what happens, a couple of things that happen is that these satrapies, these provinces in the Seleucid Empire, they start breaking away and declaring their independence. And one of the first ones to do so was a province right over here at the southeast corner of the Caspian Sea. So it's all in this area here, and then extending up into what would be modern Turkmenistan as well. This area here was a province called Parthia, and Parthia was one of the first provinces of the Seleucid Empire to break away and declare their independence. And they did that basically in about 247 BC. An Iranian nobleman named Andragonus, who was the Seleucid governor of Parthia, declared his independence, but he only ruled for a few years before he was killed in battle by the forces of Arsaces. Okay, and Arsaces the first was the leader of the Parni tribe and the Shah of Parthia, and Shah is just an Iranian word for king. He was the king of Parthia. So even though you had a Seleucid overlord, you had an ethnic Parthian king who defeated him in battle, and Parthia declared its independence. Now, what happens here very, very, very simply and easily is the fact that they control this area here, and over the next couple of hundred years, they just start moving west, and they start reconquering components of what was Alexander's empire, but also was part of the Persian Empire. And see, Parthia was effectively a part of Persia geographically and then also ethnically. They would have been interrelated to the Persians, right? So oftentimes the Parthian Empire is called a revised Persian Empire, right? That's not exactly true. The Parthian Empire was distinct from the Persian Empire that was before it and the Persian Empire that would come after it. Okay, they were distinct, right? But they had a lot of ideas interrelated to the Persians. So once they declared their independence in 247 BC, they started moving slowly west. Now, in this area here, you've got the last remnants of the Seleucid Empire. So even though Rome is coming in from the west like this, and you got Parthia moving to the west like this, there is a buffer in between them. They did not encounter each other until the middle of the 1st century BC. That is when the Romans and the Parthians finally made contact with each other. But it took the death throes, shall we say, of the Seleucid Empire in order for that to happen, because the Seleucids maintained control in this area, which acted as a buffer between Parthia and Rome. Now, not at the same time, but under the same conditions, this little independent kingdom of Judea here was also able to break away and declare independence from the Seleucid Empire in the middle of the 3rd century. Pardon me, 2nd century, said that wrong, in the middle of the 2nd century BC. So in the around 165 BC was when Judea was able to declare its independence. Now, the size of Judea, of the kingdom of Judea at that time, is literally about the size of my cursor. It was this dinky little empire, but this is just another example of these various provinces and etc. around the Seleucid Empire declaring their independence. And that is why it was due to the Seleucid Empire crumbling. And then, of course, it contributed to the Seleucid Empire crumbling. Okay. So Judea declares its independence. And for about 100 years, they were an independent kingdom again. But then again, in the middle of the 1st century, now the Romans come down. They visit, shall we say, Judea, the Roman general Pompey, and he captures Jerusalem and basically declares that Judea is now part of Rome. But this is all of this right through here, especially right up in here is the frontier between Rome and Parthia. Because you can see Rome would, from Asia Minor, they would come right through here, and then right about here is where they would hit the Euphrates River and want to cross over and keep moving east, right? But also the Parthians moving from the east to the west would get to the Euphrates right here, and that's where they would run into each other. So in later years, when the Roman general Mark Antony tried to invade Parthia, he didn't go straight at him across the Euphrates here. He did an end run and went up through Armenia like this and then came down this way, right? Because this frontier was really a big deal. And I'll share with you a piece of information that is critical to our understanding here. I'm kind of jumping ahead and I'm crossing over into the Roman Chronicle, but a core factor of God Save the King is correcting the date of the death of Herod the Great. If you look up the date of the death of Herod the Great in most textbooks and certainly online, Wikipedia, Encyclopedia Britannica, and stuff like that, they're going to tell you that Herod died in 4 BC. Herod did not die in 4 BC. As a matter of fact, although as sketchy as Wikipedia is at times, I believe in Wikipedia they actually discuss the fact that he may not have died in 4 BC. Herod died in 1 BC. And we'll talk about the details of that, how we know that in more detail in a different episode, but it's all due to the fact that the Jewish historian Josephus records an eclipse that occurred right before the death of Herod the Great. There was an eclipse in 4 BC, but it's not the right eclipse. The eclipse they should be looking at is an eclipse that occurred in 1 BC, right? Now, why is this important? Because Rome, okay, now we're actually kind of talking about the Roman Empire here for a minute. Rome, after you have the assassination of Julius Caesar, then you have the second triumvirate, which is Octavian, Mark Antony, and Lepidus. They control the Roman Empire after the death of Julius Caesar. They defeat the armies of Caesar's assassins at the Battle of Pharsalus over here in Greece. But the second triumvirate, these are 3 extremely powerful men. And the reason they formed this thing called the triumvirate was not so much to rule jointly, although that was part of the reason, but it was also, frankly, to keep each other out of each other's hair. So it was agreed that Lepidus would take the part of the Roman Empire off the map over here. Lepidus took Spain and the Western Roman Empire. Octavian took Italy and I think parts of Greece. And then Mark Antony got what was called simply the East. Now, the East included Egypt, but then it also included Asia Minor. And then, of course, what in classical education we would call the Near East, which would be this location here, right? And Antony had all kinds of problems trying to invade this part of the country, or part of the world rather, and capture it for the Roman Empire. Antony had all kinds of issues. But the reason this is important is because Julius Caesar gets assassinated. You've got the Second Triumvirate. Eventually, Antony and Octavian go to war. Octavian wins. So now Octavian becomes the true first emperor of the Roman Empire, right? And he's in control of all of this. But by the time you get to a period of time between 7 and 2 BC, Rome was essentially at peace. There were no major wars in the Roman Empire between 7 and 2 BC. Okay? That doesn't mean that there was not military activity, because Antony had brought several legions to the Near East, and after they were absorbed by Octavian, Octavian sent them back to the Near East to watch and protect the frontier with Parthia. But between 7 and 2 BC, because of this period of peace in the Roman Empire, Octavian was discharging troops. So if you were in the legion and you had been around long enough and you were able to retire, Octavian would let you go home. So even though there was a military presence, that military presence was diminishing and decreasing between 4 and 2, which in my opinion is exactly how the Parthians were able to bring a small army from Ctesiphon, which would have been right about here, right? And they would have followed the Euphrates River right up to about here, where they would have crossed the Euphrates. They would have picked up the King's Highway, right? And the King's Highway was a road that led through modern Syria and Jordan and down this way to the Sinai Peninsula and then across to Egypt. That was the King's Highway. So they would have picked up the King's Highway and gone as far as Antioch. Then I believe at Antioch they broke off and they headed for Caesarea, because they would have been looking to visit Herod, and Herod's administrative capital was Caesarea. Herod's administrative capital was not Jerusalem. That was his religious capital and the capital of Judea, but his administrative capital was Caesarea. And see, because you've got foreign policy and foreign affairs going on between the Parthians and the Romans and the Judeans and stuff like that, the Parthians and the Romans, for lack of a better word, traded hostages, so to speak. In other words, to try to keep as much peace as possible between these two superpowers, you had family members of the Parthian king Phraates IV who got sent to Rome to live with Octavian, and it was basically trading hostages, right? So the point being is that this is where I was driving at, is that under the Parthian Empire, the Magi became a unified body again. Under the Parthian Empire, they became known as the House of Magi, right? And it is most likely that they met at the court at Ctesiphon, but there also would have been significant numbers of Magi at Nineveh, and also in other cities around the Parthian Empire. But due to this foreign policy and this foreign exchange between Parthia and Greece, and then Parthia and Rome, and then Parthia and Judea, the Magi always would have been part of this process. As a matter of fact, we recognize this because go all the way back to the conquest of Judea by the Babylonians, right? And it's in the book of Jeremiah where we read that the royal entourage occupied the gates of Jerusalem. That when they conquered Jerusalem, they went in and they sat in the gates. And we get the names of several of these officials. And we are told that one is Rabsaris. That means the chief of the eunuchs. We're told that one is Rabmag. He is the chief of the Magi. See, so when these countries would interact like this, the Magi would be part of it, because not only were they these, like I said, these religious officials, but they would have been political officials, which meant they also would have taken part in legitimate ambassadorial policies and procedures, right? And also one of the things they did, going all the way back to Babylon, but especially during the Parthian Empire, was that they oversaw royal succession. Now, what does that mean? Okay, let me get another slide up here that we can look at. These would have been the three responsibilities of the Magi. Okay, so in the order on the screen here, number one, onerology, okay, which is dream interpretation. And we see that very clearly in scripture from Daniel, right? Daniel was appointed Rabmag, the chief of the Magi, due to his demonstrated ability to interpret dreams, right? He interpreted Nebuchadnezzar's dream for him. Nebuchadnezzar gets blown away and says, okay, you are now the chief of the wise men because you're better at this than all these yahoos. Okay. So they were, and then when we read about the Magi in the Gospel of Matthew, we read very clearly that God spoke to them in a dream, right? That when Herod sends them to Bethlehem and they meet the young child Jesus, right? Then it says, God spoke to the Magi in a dream and said, do not go back to Herod, return home by another route. So dream interpretation was a big part of what they did, right? They also were into celestial observation and interpretation. And this is obvious. When they arrived at the court of Herod the Great, they said, we have seen his star in the east. We have seen his star in the rising, in the heliacal rising. So, and like we've talked about many times already, even today, this type of celestial observer had been in Mesopotamia for a long time, right? And here they are interacting with the court of Herod the Great, but they also would have had interactions with the Nabateans. They would have had interactions with the Romans. They would have had interactions with every foreign power around them. You know, we sometimes, here you go, rescuing truth from familiarity. We sometimes get the idea that they didn't have international relations back then. Of course they did. As a matter of fact, okay, let's do this. We got to go back to our my map here. Let me go back to the map, because this is critical, because this will come up as part of our story. Also, I'm focusing right now on this area right here, but the Magi and the Parthians, because their empire extended all the way over here, it didn't go, they lost some of this that Alexander had controlled. They lost some of it, and they didn't really control quite as far as Alexander did, but the Parthians did control this area all right through here up into Turkmenistan. And then what's very interesting here is it was the Parthians, okay, it's the Parthians that, quote unquote, opened trade to the Far East, okay? Trade already existed between Italy and China. Did you hear me say that? Trade already existed between Italy and China, but it did not happen over land. It happened by sea, right? Because ships would come up. You can't see all of it on the map here. Ships would go around the Indian subcontinent, and then they would sail around the coast here down, and then across and around the coast of the Arabian Peninsula, and then they would, once they would get into a port city here on the southern coast of Arabia, then they would travel by caravan up through Arabia and up through the Levant into Asia Minor and then off this way, right? Then once Alexander conquered Egypt, right, their ships would simply go into Eastern Africa. That's where they would offload, and then they would go by caravan to Alexandria and then by ship to Rome, right? So trade with China already existed prior to the Silk Road opening up, but the reason you did not have a land route all the way from Rome, all the way through Asia Minor, the Middle East, Central Asia to China is because it was these empires here in the middle that controlled being able to make the trip, right? So it was the Parthians that, quote unquote, opened the Silk Road because they opened the road between Ctesiphon, which would have been right here, and I'm forcing myself to remember the name of the city. I believe it was Samarkand, and Samarkand. Oh man, I don't remember off the top of my head whether it's in Turkmenistan or whether it's in Uzbekistan, but Samarkand is right in this area right here. I think it's in Turkmenistan. It might be in Uzbekistan. It might be right about there, but Samarkand is right in this area here. So the road between Ctesiphon and Samarkand was critical because then that opened up the road to China over here, right? So this is a critical component of the Parthian Empire as well, is that they opened up trade between the Mediterranean and the Far East, right? So all of this factors into who the Magi were and what role they played and things like that. They, like I said, they were dream interpreters, they were celestial observers, and they also oversaw royal succession. Now, why that's important is because the Parthians, see, they were the House of Magistanes, and in the Parthian Empire, the Parthians almost had what was almost like a parliamentary system. Now, it was not a representative system like we think about, where they, or that I'm aware of, it wasn't a representative system, but the two houses, the upper house was the royals, the royalty, and then the lower house was the House of Magistanes. And the House of Magistanes advised the upper house. But one of the things the House of Magistanes also did is they oversaw royal succession, because the Parthians engaged in a practice that was very uncommon for their time. I don't know of any other city, state, or nation or empire that practiced this at that time, which was they didn't automatically practice the right of primogeniture when a king died, right? The right of primogeniture means when the king dies, his eldest son becomes king, right? The Parthians did not practice that as automatic. Very important. They did not practice that as automatic. So when the king dies, it would then go to the House of Magistanes. The Magi, they would determine who the next king of the empire would be. And isn't that provocative? Because what are they doing when they show up at the court of Herod the Great? The Gospel of Matthew tells us very clearly that they show up at the court of Herod the Great and they say, "Where is he who is born King of the Jews? For we have come to worship him," right? What a provocative statement, because this is what these guys do. And here we go. This would not have been a mystery to Herod the Great, because there would have been international relations between the Parthians and the Romans and the Judeans and the Nabateans and all these little client and the Armenians. I forgot to mention them. The Armenians in north of Upper Mesopotamia, right? Because there was international relations between all of these client kingdoms and provinces of the Roman Empire and provinces of the Parthian Empire, satrapies, there would have been international relations. The Magi would have been part of these international relations. So therefore, they were not a mystery to the Romans. They were not a mystery to the Egyptians. They were not a mystery to the court of Herod the Great. They would have known exactly who these guys were. So this lends a lot of meaning to the record in Matthew that, once again, when they show up at the court of Herod the Great, and what courage it had to have taken. I mean, you talk about, okay, forgive my language, you talk about balls. Oh my God, these guys were an official ambassadorial entourage of kingmakers, of king choosers. That is what they do. And they read in the stars, okay? They read in the stars that this great king had been born in Judea. They read in the stars that a great king had been born in Judea, and yet they also knew that the great king wasn't Herod, despite the fact that he called himself Herod the Great, that Herod was not the great king. So they saddle up an official ambassadorial entourage accompanied by military escort, because, see, go back to what we've been talking about now. Go back to the map, okay? Right? Go back to our map here. This whole area right through here is the frontier between the Roman Empire and the Parthian Empire. It is the frontier. And by this time, by the time we get to the time of the birth of Jesus, now the Parthian and the Romans have been at war several times. Mark Antony, Crassus tried to invade Parthia, failed miserably. Then Antony tries to invade Parthia, fails miserably. These guys have been at each other now for quite some time. So you've got Roman legions up and down the frontier here, protecting the frontier against Parthian invasion, and then occasionally trying to do an end run, going up into Armenia and coming down this way to try to invade Parthia. But now these Parthian kingmakers, right? They come up the Euphrates like this. They get to the city of Rasafa, where they cross the Euphrates. And like I said, I believe due to this period of relative peace in the Roman Empire, and the fact that Augustus, had been reducing the number of troops in this area, this is what allowed the Parthian Magi to make it this far without being noticed. That's what allowed them to make it this far without being noticed. And then they picked up the King's Highway and they dropped down to Damascus and then Caesarea. I believe that certainly by the time they reached Damascus, that is when certainly the Judeans would have known, and possibly the Romans would have known by that point, because I don't think that when they arrived at Jerusalem that Herod was unaware. I think Herod had been aware for several days, maybe even a couple of weeks, by the time I think several days is a better estimate, but it's possible it could have been a couple of weeks. But I think when the Parthians hit Damascus, that they either sent advance riders to Jerusalem, or Herod's own agents in Damascus would have ridden to Jerusalem to let him know. And there was a Roman legion right in the area. There is a little base at a place called Raphaiana, right, that was very near to Damascus, where it is highly probable that a Roman legion was stationed right there. Now, were they there? Hard to say, because of this drawback in Roman legions at that time. Were they at Raphaiana? Hard to say. Maybe they were, maybe they weren't. If they were they in full force? Were they ready and prepared to confront the Parthians, right? Or did the Parthians talk to them? We don't know, and say, hey, we're just, this is, yeah, we have military escort, but we're not here to fight. Hard to say. But we have totally run out of time. I love talking about this stuff. I really hope you enjoyed listening tonight. We have covered a lot of the background information about who the Magi were and why it's important to our story that they were not just three wise guys on the back of camels. These were an elite class of political and religious official that had three primary responsibilities. They interpreted dreams, they read the stars, and they also oversaw royal succession. We also know that they gave a daily intelligence briefing to the king. That would have been one of their huge responsibilities, was to give this daily intelligence briefing to the king. So these men were very important. They engaged in international relations with the other city-states, nations, and empires around them, and they would have been known to the Romans and to Herod. They did not show up as a surprise. What was a surprise about it was the size of the entourage that shows up, and we know that because the Bible tells us that Herod was greatly troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. Three wise guys on camels would not have troubled Herod. He was a very shrewd political operator. That wouldn't have been a big deal, but a small army would have been a very big deal to Herod, and he would have freaked out a little bit. And what we didn't talk about today, which we will talk about next time, is the fact that Herod had history with the Parthians. So that's where we will take up next time. We're going to look at Herod and the Parthians next time on God Save the King. Thank you for joining me. My name is Tim Kais. I am the host of God Save the King. Please make sure you check out my show every Friday night at 10 p.m. Eastern on the Truth Be Told Radio Network. God Save the King.